So yeah, it's a quick feedback, and everybody can say what the break percent is, but really the point is that you can look at it and say, oh look, I got this whole utility package that's only at 40%. That's probably not a good idea. Or you can look at it and say, oh look, my UI package is at 10%. I don't care, or whatever, because that's real thin. So.
Off the top of your head, do you know if it was configurable to basically take out certain sets of files that you didn't want to check?
Yes, it was, because I actually, the way Dave structured his code, or maybe it was another project structured his code, they had kind of the test classes right in there, or they had some kind of resources in there that I wanted to take out, so I don't remember how configurable it was, but it was pretty configurable where I could say, don't look in this directory. I'm not sure if it was per file, but I don't forget. Yep.
So the tool, if I understood this right, you're writing a unit test.
Yep.
And this is watching the code that the unit tests are exercising. Does it work in conjunction with a particular unit test framework, or how
JUnit. It also, I never used Clover, to be honest, the Java version. I used the .NET one. But they advertise that the Java one's compatible with JUnit, TestMG, and JTiger. And the .NET one is compatible with NUnit. So what it does essentially is it compiles your code a certain way where it's not what it really does, but it essentially puts breakpoints at every line and some other, basically puts hooks in there. And then you unit test you instrument. You don't even have to use unit test, to be honest. If you just wanted to see what a user actually hits, you can have a user do it. It doesn't even have to be NUnit. But whatever you have instrument in your code.
What's the slowdown rate?
Well, I wouldn't. I don't remember. I thought it was a little bit, but yeah, it wasn't too bad within my actual IDE when I was running it as a tool. But to be honest, what I essentially did is I didn't use it so much in my tools. I used it as part of my overnight builds, and at that point I didn't care. I just got the report the next morning and said, oh, look, I got to hit this a little more. So if there was some slowdown, obviously I wouldn't release a version that's been, I think they call it clovered, when they put in all their hooks, because the app does seem to run a little bit slower, noticeably, at least C#. So.
Cool. Thanks, Brian.
So, yep.
Patrick Foley, Patrick Consulting.
Pragmatic business requirements. Unless you write code exclusively for your own consumption, you're going to have to talk with customers and users at some point. Lots of different ways you can communicate business requirements, but ultimately I think they all ask the same question. How do we know when the system works? It's a real high-level view of focusing on testing. So if nothing else, when you talk with the customer and user, try to get requirements, ask that question. How do we know when the system works? Do more, make sure that whatever you do answers that question. How do we know when the system works? From a very pragmatic level, dealing with a customer recently, had challenges of not getting all of the test data required or test parameters required to be able to test something thoroughly. So therefore, I won't know I won't know when my system is working. So that's part of the general quality of requirements, is finding out what I need to know whether my system is working. Quick note there, we have lots of different tools that I'm going to discuss here to embody this, but artifacts don't equal processes and practices. We have formal artifacts that are executed, created, used in an agile way, and we have informal artifacts that are created and used in an extremely non-agile way. So they're not, artifacts and practices are not inherently, they're not part of the same thing. Typically when we talk agile, we talk practices. For the rest of this talk, I want to focus mostly on artifacts and how we give you slight thoughts about how you might still fit them into a process that you want to be agile. The simplest kind of artifact is just a business case, just a high level, this is what I want. Prose description, hand waving, hieroglyphics, however you do it, talking to someone, say, I want something that does this. Again, as long as it answers that question, typically as a high level business goal, this can be a good form of requirement. I will know the system is working when my spam disappears from my inbox and I no longer get spam and my spam filter is working. Pretty basic declaration of a requirement. For all but the most trivial systems, however, we need to break things down a bit, and I think most of us here like to use stories or scenarios. The key aspect of stories to me is that they're specific, and most customers and users, and probably developers, have an easier time communicating with specifics than with generalities. So the specific nature of stories is helpful. Even though they're lightweight, they help us break down an overall business goal into manageable chunks, so that if we know that each individual story is working, if you will, meaning that if we've executed that story, then given a stack of story cards, if all of those are working, then the system is working, so long as the system is defined as this stack of story cards. Going one step, a little bit more formal, is use cases, which get a bad rap for good reason in the Agile world, because the practice of sending people off to do use case analysis for 2 years and coming back and giving us requirements is pretty useless. But to me, the only difference between use case and story is that a use case is general, where a story is specific. And use cases, as, say, Alistair Cockburn describes them in writing effective use cases, can be a very useful Agile tool, particularly when you're dealing with people who have a little bit more computer experience, a little bit more knowledge, and can speak effectively in general concepts instead of specific concepts. Key is they should be tests. And likewise, we know our system is working if the stack of use cases that I've defined as my system, if each of those use cases is working. Drawings, prototypes, mock-ups. If you're creating a product, if you're making something to sell that people are going to have to decide whether to part money with, or that doesn't exist yet and is kind of to solve a nebulous problem, the only thing users care about is the visual representation. So your business requirements have to be visual in this requirement. You can add some other things. The visual thing is the only thing users care about. Again, the Agile, a la getting real in 37 signals, and take it to the extreme of having actual running visual code, or running a website, for example, or even relatively non-Agile people like Steve McConnell talk about visual requirements being most important. There's an implied discussion there with visual requirements. It's not just the requirements. It's presumed that I present it to someone and say, see this thing, this is what I'm going to do, etc., etc., this is what I understand it's going to do. What makes this an Agile, sane process is if the cycle time from the time I show you to the time I try to implement that is, let's say, less than 3 weeks or so. If I have a big stack of visual stuff that then I go off for a year to build, it's rarely going to be effective. User help. A way of formalizing visual requirements, particularly for a product, often neglected. User help can be useful for describing visual stuff, how it's supposed to work behind the scenes, and then I can know, well, if the system is behaving as the help describes it, then it's working. Goals model. Goals are a really useful way of organizing large enterprise-type requirements into manageable chunks that then each business goal can be addressed in a more agile manner. This is something I'm excited about. I'll talk about that more in a later talk, perhaps. Then more formal methods like UML, OCL define contracts. I know my system is working when all of the contracts defined on this black box are working. For mappy type requirements, for formal things that need to be formalized, like tax returns or something, this type of requirements are great, but they'd be even better if we could describe them in a DSL, where then I have actual running system tests when I'm done. Then I would really know when my system is working. So to me, as we go through all these possibilities, if we could ever get to a formal DSL where we can communicate with our customers, is this what you want, and actually run that against some sort of black box test as a system test, then we really know. I think I'm up.
What's a DSL?
Sorry. Excuse me. Domain-specific language. Popular technique these days for writing your own mini language. It's typically very high level, can be understood by people who are experts in the domain that the language is for.
Something like fitness?
What, fitness?
Yeah.
Not familiar with fitness, anyone?
It's a web-based tool where you basically put in a table of someone writes a tool for that test, and then the end user will come along and say it's going, when I provide these things, I expect to get this. It's kind of a tabular way.
That sounds pretty similar to what I'm getting at from that's pretty GUI, or it sounds like a pretty high-level implementation of it that's getting along to what I'm thinking of. But I have to look at that further.
I think this is a little more structured, but it's the same idea. It goes to solving the same problem.
Ruby, a popular thing these days is Ruby makes it quite easy to create your own DSLs, your own mini languages that someone who doesn't necessarily know Ruby could manipulate things reasonably easily.
With the, when you say domain-specific language, does this mean that the people talking this language would be like shrinks, if this is a psychological thing, or lawyers, if it's a law thing?
Let's say I have some, not GUI, but actual reasonably complex business behavior for which I can describe contracts. If I could word that specifically in a domain-specific language that they would understand, literally using their terms, contracts, court, law, etc., to describe how things, maybe scheduling, etc., appointment, and things like that. If I could describe the business behavior and the guarantees that they want this black box to adhere to in a DSL, then I can, in black box exposed interfaces that the DSL understood.
So it's the language
then I
of
could
the
exercise.
domain expert.
Correct. Correct. And if it was runnable, then it's like a really, really big unit test.
Is this synonymous with the terminology executable specifications?
I would think so. I'm not familiar with that particular terminology, but that's sure what it feels like I'm talking about.
Don't think so?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Okay. I unfortunately have to leave for a softball game, which I really apologize for, but I was, if you could point to one of the other AO people, because I work mostly for AO these days, if you could give them a heads up on that, or I'll give you my card if you'd like to follow up on that. Anything else? Thanks.
Steve, you have something to say about
Nice
stories?
one, Scott.
Yeah. Well represented.
Yeah. Pat's a great presenter because he lives in a great neighborhood. This talk got started in church. I was in church, and my church is it's a purpose-driven church. But what I noticed is like, Pat, you left one of these.
Yeah.
Okay. What I noticed was, I'm in Sunday school, and the guy says, he says something or other. He says, does anybody have a story that relates to this point? I'm thinking to myself, when I was a kid, it'd be like, people would be explaining things to you. They wouldn't be soliciting stories from you. And so I thought, well, that was something strange. Why this church is not just, and my church is very story-oriented. So then after I hear that, I'm thinking about that. I get this email from Carl about story-driven development. I got very excited about that. And because, well, first thing is, what's going on in the story? What is the deal with stories? I mean, and so I sort of like have been thinking about that, and this is the result of that. First thing is, I went to Carl's talk, and he talked about story-driven development, but he didn't tell me what a story is. So I went to Google, and it says a story is a message that tells the particulars of an act or occurrence or events presented in writing or dramatic or cinema or television program. Narrative is interesting. So that we're using the narrative form to essentially capture something reasonable. And I thought to myself, okay, story, that's cool, but story as opposed to what? Because I knew that this emphasis on story displaced something else. And I tried to find an antithesis that goes along with the thesis of story, and I came up with an explanation. I'm going to tell you how this works. So I went and I Googled explanation, and I got that, a statement that makes something comprehensible by describing the relevant. And so I then went and what I want to do is I want to contrast the difference between this thesis and antithesis that I've set up. And I'll start by telling a story. You're standing there beside a big lake, and you look at your watch and you can't see anything because it's dark. And you wait, and you wait. And a few hours later, it gets light, and then you look at the clock, and it says 6:12 a.m. Great. And so I look at the clock, I wait, the sun goes up. Oh, I see this on the horizon, this big hot thing. Goes up over the sun. He goes up, and a few hours later, by the twilight's last gleaming, I look at the watch again, and it says 9:07 p.m. So get your game done before 9:07 p.m. tonight. Okay, so this is great. This is the story. Now, are there any questions about this story? No. Are there any arguments about this story? No. You might have a different watch who says, well, your watch is 5 minutes fast, or was this Eastern Daylight Time, or so on. But there's few arguments, few questions. But now, let's explain this story. How many times have you been in a software meeting, and the meeting's going great, and then you just get bogged down? Does that ever happen to you? Yeah, liars. And what bogs you down is the explanation. You get bogged down in the hows. Okay? So let's explain sunrise. Here's Earth. Okay? And here's the sun. And it goes around, or maybe it goes around this way, I don't know. And that's great. It explains sunrise, and it even explains these little things called fixed stars. So we've got this problem with these wandering stars called planets. And there's a real problem with this model, with this thing called the retrograde motion of Mars. Okay, and to explain this phenomena, what this guy, a brilliant scientist of the ancient world called Ptolemy, came up with this notion of epicycles. And this behavior was able to capture the phenomena, explain the phenomena, did a very good job of it. But for some reason, you guys snickered when I brought it up, right? Because there's a competing explanation, right? Copernicus came up with it. And he's got, and this doesn't fit. What's really cool about this, when Galileo got in such trouble for this model fit the data worse. Does anybody know why it fit the data worse?
Bad data.
No, the data's good. Copernicus is very good about
Using daylight savings time?
no.
You want to use circles.
They want to use circles. These are circles here, and it doesn't fit as well.
The universe not being a perfect circle.
Yeah, exactly. And what happened was they were ellipses. And once they made the model to incorporate ellipses, the data then fit better. But even then, ellipses, perfect circles, come on. We had a lot of argument about that. And how did you actually settle the argument between these two competing explanations? Well, you settled the argument with another story. Galileo Galilei was able to settle the argument by telling another story, the story of the moons of Jupiter. Basically, he could essentially go, look through the telescope, and see the moons of Jupiter going around each other. So what happens is you settle arguments about explanation, you settle arguments about the hows with more stories. And so the story of the Galilean moons, now this story's got to cover all the what, okay? But you can't stop there. You've got the stories that cover the what. Nobody's going to argue about the stories. People are going to argue about the explanations. And don't commit to your how until your story's straight. Now, great. Stories are great. Let me tell you another story. This is not a happy story. This is a sad story. In 1974, Richard Feynman of blessed memory, another sad thing, said in the South Seas there's a cargo cult of people who during the war, this being the Second World War, they would see what happened. They saw the airplanes with good things in them would come along, land, and it dispensed good things. They liked the goods coming out of the airplanes, so they arranged to make things like runways. And they put fires by these runways. And they built a control tower next to the runway. And they had a guy sit in it and put sticks on his head. And they put sticks on the thing, but the planes didn't land. Okay? The story, they had the story right. They had the phenomena right, but they didn't have the explanation. And so here's a t-shirt that my kids, they like this brand of t-shirt. And there is no explanation. Because in order to do the explanation, the South Seas Islanders could not explain the phenomenon of planes landing until they understood from things like World War II, aeronautics, radio, and other things. So, so you need a conceptual framework that fits in order to do your. And what are we talking about? We're talking about really the the difference between story that captures the requirements and explanation that captures the design. Okay, I just got one more slide. Okay. Now, the trouble with story-driven is it risks the wrath of the gods. There's a guy by the name of Ed Gordon that some of us may have heard of. He goes and says, because what happens is the stories, we sort of bounce around between these extremes. Story-driven, a Victorian novel is an instance of a story. Pride and Prejudice, one of those impossible to read things. They're generally thousands of pages. We've all been saddled with these specs that are impossible, these requirement statements that are impossible to deal with because they're so stinking long, they're so obtuse. And what Jordan says is that you should never come up with a 2,000-page monolithic Victorian novel. Break it up into a few hundred short stories, which I think that would avoid his wrath. And I think that's really what we're sort of getting at in this notion, in this way of organizing things. And then I want to say finally that story-driven is postmodern. And there's the definition of postmodernism, a media-influenced aesthetic. I don't like that definition because I see modernism as being more interested in reason, the age of reason. And this sort of like dispenses with the slavish adherence to consistency. You really want to capture the phenomenon. And that's what we're doing when we're putting together systems. I'm done talking. Got questions?
So tell me what postmodern is again?
It's a media-influenced aesthetic sensibility of the late 20th century. What it really is whatever comes after modernism. That's the best way to look at it. It's not modernism. And because it's not modernism, it's an amorphous mass. So you've got Larry Walsh saying postmodernism is this, and yeah, fine. Okay, and you've got somebody else saying postmodernism is that. And it's one of the, basically the notion is whatever follows modernism. Modernism died in the 1920s, and then the corpse has been rotting since then. So philosophy. Anything else? Does it make any sense? I'm done.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so we had a last minute cancellation, so now we are halfway through. So why don't we take a break, have some snacks, and then read. Okay, we're going to get going again. Time Nazi has his bell back. Our next speaker is Ed.
Almost didn't give this speech because it's sort of a, not everyone's going to agree with me, but I like the input. So it's my own personal opinion. So I was listening to these History 5 podcasts from the University of Berkeley, which is the European history. And they were talking about the Enlightenment and the word maturity, because during the Enlightenment there was this big argument over maturity. There was a very famous essay published, a newspaper had a competition over this. The winning essay said that maturity, you've reached maturity when you know what you believe, that you believe it, and you can stand on your own. And this was very unique to the Enlightenment, because previously to that you would say, I have done the right thing because the king said it was right. Or, I have done the right thing because the Magna Carta said it was right. Or, I did the right thing because the Pope said it was right. So, well, they might be right, and you might come to an agreement, but you've reached maturity when, of your own self, and your own fully developed value system, you say, I do this thing because I believe it. Interesting. So, a lot of people around here, some of you have known what I do for a living and what I've done in school. And I studied maturity a lot. And I've come to these conclusions. I studied business maturity, for example. I have my 3-year-old daughter as an example. She wants to have her cake and eat it too. She's saving up for a princess castle, but every week she gets her allowance and goes to the candy store. Both at the same time. That's okay. She's free. Right? She can't make her own decisions for herself. A couple weeks ago, she literally said, I don't like it when everything is not about me.
She's 3. And I make decisions for her. My wife makes decisions for her. And when she grows up and becomes an adult, she'll be able to make those decisions herself. We protect her in that way. The law protects her in that way. We say she's not mature. She has to appeal to an external standard for some decision. That got me to think about this capability maturity model. You're familiar with the CMS? It's a 600, 700-page document that describes how you would do things. And it gives you a value system to follow. And that value system is very obvious if you take the time to read it. Contract negotiation is more important than customer collaboration. Following a defined plan is more important than responding to change. Processes and tools are more important than individuals and interactions. You just read the book, and that's the value system you have to do if you're doing the CMM. Right? What's that? That's why it's 700 pages long. And it's a spec for your process. So imagine a requirements doc that's 700 pages long. Imagine the kind of policies that you have to then make up a policy that folds into that. So every page of that, you probably have 5-10 pages of your own. Let's think about that again, take a step back. The CMM was created by the Department of Defense because they couldn't control software projects. So they created this standard, they hired somebody to create it. So, what you do with the CMM is you go to the federal government and you say, I am CMM 3. I am good because these guys said I was good. I am mature because some external entity said I'm mature. What do you know about the word maturity? That's not what maturity means, right? You know, that's not what the word means. So two takeaways, I'll give you this. The first one is people, you can go Google this, you can read this, people talk about agile CMM, right? And the definition of agile is what? Responding to change over following a plan. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. It's the exact opposite. Value system. And CMM says you have to have this value system and you have to develop the processes in a way to apply to the value system. And then we'll certify you. So people that say, well, you can do agile and CMM and not, well, they might say you can be as agile as possible. You can do as little documentation as you're allowed. You can run your environment as lean as you possibly can. Oh, okay. But honestly, my takeaway is that pretty much you don't get into selling something. And when you hear that, keep your eyes open. Second takeaway is the company says, we are good because we are CMM 5, because we fit the external standard. That's not a mature statement.
By definition.
Sorry. So, thanks. Have time for questions?
Sure, of course. Absolutely. Are you saying the only way to be mature is to be CMM compliant? No.
I think what he's saying is daughter was CMM.
But what are you saying and what's the value of maturity in a process? Knowing that you're doing what you think is the right thing?
Yes, actually, one of the things that I like about the CMM is they value stability, repeatable, stable, repeatable, predictable. They have all these stable words they say are important. And so they take a stand for something, right? And if you do CMM, what you're going to get is we will be able to tell you when we're done. We're going to be able to tell you how much it'll cost and how good it will be, right? Now, it might take 5 years, and it might cost us $200 million, and it might be really bad. We'll be able to predict those things at the beginning of the project. And typically what you do is you pay a whole lot of money in paperwork and documentation and reviews to get that we're still on course notification. But they take a stand for something, right? So if you're in a contract, you have to pick on a topic contract?
Sure.
You might say you will get awesome tests. And whether or not you disagree with us that this testing is too much, we're going to test how to make the heck out of our code. And when we put a change in next week, we're going to get a run regression suite, and we're going to get, boom, 100% coverage or 100 unit tests passed or whatever it is. We're going to say, this code is good enough to go into production, to go live. And you're going to get it on most of your projects, but that's our value system. And we determine that on our own. Now, if you don't have maturity, then you get things like, well, somebody else told me it was really important to have branch coverage. Or somebody else told me it was really important to have a factory class to use this design patterns thing. So everything has a factory and everything has this interface, and we have to go over and say, well, that's a whole lot of lines of code for hello world. Yes, but there are also classes, there are some classes, and you have domain expertise. Right? Because you don't really get it, because you're appealing to an authority, because you haven't made that decision of your own self that that thing is valuable. And that's why I like maturity. Because you say, I've thought about this issue, and I've taken my opinion and taken a stand for it. Right? So, with my daughter, she doesn't like this idea that actions have consequences. She spends too long in the bathtub and still wants her story. Right? Yeah, and the best way to motivate them is to remind them of the consequences. Okay, you can stay all the time you want in the bathtub, but then you're not going to get your story tonight. Boom, she's out.
So maturity is experience coupled to reflection.
Yes, and you're going to live so that whole independent value system I was talking about earlier, every example with my daughter folds into that. Because if you believe what you believe because you believe it, because you've got your own independent value system, you will live with the consequences of your actions. You will say, I know that I can make millions of dollars trading with Enron in this wrong deal. I know I can make it, and I wouldn't get caught. But I'm not going to do it, and I'm going to live with that consequence. Yeah.
Suppose you're looking for a service provider to do something for you, and you've got 2 or 3 candidates, and you really don't know much about them. But somebody comes to you and says, you know, this candidate over here really has a mature process, and these guys don't know what they're talking about. Would this be a possible value of CMM?
Who's that guy?
Who's what guy?
The guy who says these guys really know what they're talking about.
The guy who did the assessment.
Who is he? What's his name?
He's a guy who's been trained.
Who is he? I mean, if it's Ed Weller, who I know, who's done CMM assessments for 20 years and talks about leadership, and talks about empowerment, and talks about skills and people, then yeah, Ed Weller will do a good CMM assessment. Who's the assessor? Does he need to be a CMM lead assessor?
Part of the point of the whole maturity model is to have an objective framework to tell those things. When you go through an assessment, they're very rigorous about it. So the element of subjectivity is reduced quite a bit.
So I can outsource the decision of whether someone's good or not and trust someone else, right?
You might not have your choice. You don't have time to investigate 3 service providers, so you're going to take someone's word for it that has spent time that you don't have to spend. Is that valuable or not?
If I have a reason to believe that person and they put their name on the line. Not because they're a CMMI certified lead assessor, because I work with them, and they're good.
So the only thing that counts in your mind is personal recommendation.
I'm saying that goes pretty far.
Yeah, but that's pretty subjective, isn't it? What if I don't like your guy?
I think what happens is that there's this presumption of objectivity, which is very a modern idea. But the notion is that if you're going to be mature, you've got to be independent. You can't be codependent. And this capability maturity model has got, as I understand it, wired into it certain values of predictability over change. Okay.
And that's assuming you really do it. I've worked with CMM5 companies that can't ship software.
Well, the other thing is you can go Spice instead of CMM, which is really a much
Yeah, but with Spice, for the most part, you pick what's important to you and you improve it because you think it'll make you better.
Like using CMM that way is akin to a test tool that provides very little value but stands easy to run. It doesn't require much thought, it doesn't deliver much utility, but it's an easy single number, kind of like a GPA.
I think a better analogy is a board-certified physician, for instance. You know, take a guy who does medical school in the Caribbean and plays golf all the time versus someone who does yoga.
Let me reframe this a little bit differently, okay? Because I'm not really all that opposed to the whole idea of CMM. I'm really not. It's written very poorly. It doesn't really tell me anything. It's comprehensive, it's not comprehensible. Companies don't really read it. Assessors, If you show me a CMM that's good, then I have a different conversation. You could get there with price.
Well, see, you were talking maturity, and you equate maturity with CMM, and that's my first complaint. I think there's ways you can assess maturity without talking CMM.
I agree.
Yeah.
There are better ways.
Thanks, Sam. Our next speaker is Beverly DeSoto.
Association.
That's the manager of testing at Smith's Aerospace.
I was looking around the internet and I found a couple of jokes, and one of them was by a company, the advertising manager at UPS said, "This project is so important, we can't let things that are more important interfere with it." So that's funny, but it's kind of the way I feel about the XPwm Michigan Board of Directors. So I'm going to put a plug for that. Right now we're looking for a couple of board members, and I know that we've mentioned it a few times, and some of you just sat back and said, yeah. So I wanted to let you know what the board does, and also some of the things that I found beneficial about being on board, and hope that all of you will think about it. The board meets 3 to 4 times a year for about an hour. We have been traditionally meeting at a breakfast meeting at 7 in the morning from 7 to 8, but that could change. We get board members that are just not morning people. And what we do, the biggest thing, our biggest job is to find speakers for meetings, because if we didn't have people to speak, we wouldn't have meetings. So that's one of the big things. We talk about what topics we want to cover, and if you're a developer, or if you're a tester, if you're in management, we try to mix them up, but you kind of a say. We had a lot of things on testing last year, and lunch this year, and I'm a tester, so it kind of tells you something. We also have to assign people to find these speakers. So if you go to conferences, or even if you don't, you can find emails of authors and things like that, and you write them and try to get them to come and speak here. And this gives you a real rapport with the speakers, which is kind of nice. Another thing we do at the meetings is we review the budget. And an organization like this can't run without money. We have to pay for travel expenses for speakers. Sometimes we pay a small honorarium for them. We have to buy food for the meetings. So that all costs money. So, we have to decide where that goes and what we want to spend on what. And then we also do some marketing things. Because the more sponsors we get, the better these meetings will be, the higher caliber speakers we can get. So it's really pretty simple. It's been a couple hours a month maybe, is all, so it's not that much. We are requesting, around 2 to 3 hours a month. If you get your job done before that, if you get your 3 speakers for the year and have done a little bit of marketing, you're probably good. And some of the things I found out, I've been on the board since the beginning. I mean, we started with, 4 or 5 people? Well, there might have been 10 at the first meeting, but it was small. But the thing I mentioned before about the topics that are near and dear to you, you really get a say in that. It's not just a one-person thing. You really get to express your opinion on who you'd like to see here. The hooking up with speakers on a personal basis is really neat. When I worked at Atomic Objects way back when, it wasn't that long ago, I wanted to contact Ron Jeffries. He runs this other website, and I wanted him to point to Atomic Object. It was one of the ways that we had some open source stuff that I thought would be interesting on his site. And it took about a month for him to finally respond, and that was after 2 emails on it. And he said, yeah, when I get to it, remind me in a month. If I write him today, he will write me by tomorrow back. And it's because of the rapport that I've gained through XPwm Michigan. So you get to really get to know these speakers. We have a pre-meeting or a pre-dinner with many of the speakers, and you, as a board member, you get invited to that. So there's a lot of speakers we've had here that I've got to have dinner with. And it's usually right before this meeting, so it's not really a lot out of your schedule, and it's paid for. That's one of the things that I don't think I've paid for a breakfast yet either. It also looks really good on a resume. It's a community service thing, obviously. It's something out of your own free time. But I don't know, the benefits are really good. It's not too much effort. We'd love to have some different people on the board. It'd be nice to get different companies on there. You don't need to be a sponsor. beyond Smiths, and right now we're not a sponsor. So everybody think about it and let Carl know if you're interested. The board is voting on who the next board members will be, so if you're interested, please tell them, and you know, we'll get back with you, and hopefully we'll get 2 new board members this year with some new ideas and things like that.
I have a question. We have 8 meetings a year and 5 board members. So if you wanted to arrange 3, that's fantastic, and I won't do anything. But really, you don't have to. 8 to 5, you know. And then the other thing is the Great Lakes Software Excellence Conference, GLCC, happening in late October. Looks to be becoming hopefully a regular event and something that XPwm Michigan would be involved in and moving forward and giving professional life, hopefully. So I would imagine that in the future the board will be getting involved with that more. So that's another opportunity to jump in on the ground floor of something and really have some positive influence in the community and keeping software and IT stuff competitive in West Michigan.
Yeah, there probably will be, I would imagine when that thing gets going, some delegation, and we'll try to ask, the board will ask for committees and things like that for different people. It's kind of run, though, as simply as we can, even GLSEC is. Try to do the least amount of work we have to do to get the best job out there. So it's not a lot of bottom down paperwork.
All the questions are coming from the board members.
Yes.
How many, there's 5 board members now, and are some of them resigning, and are we adding new ones?
I think we're going to try to stick at 5, you know,
Right.
6 be fine by me.
Yeah, we have 2 resigning.
What's the term?
Like
3 years.
As long as you're
no term limits.
I think in the bylaws it says something about this fall, 2-3 years, something like
I
that.
think
Staggered
it was 3
terms.
years. Yeah, they are staggered, and then pretty much if you're doing your job, you get voted back on, and there's a lot of people that want your job. We're just kind of started, but we do have, we're really set up legally and all that. It's a 501c6, and we have the bylaws and all that kind of stuff.
And certainly a year of good work would be much appreciated if you don't have more than a year to commit that. Thanks, Beth. Next speaker is Eric Wallace from XPwm.
Hi. What I'm going to talk about today is just a little bit of a, fits on here, looks like it. All of us sort of starts off with a this one. Yeah. Especially if it's upside down. I'm in charge of developing commercial software. We have about 200 to 400, I don't know exactly how many it is, installations. And then, as well as what you have is you have an internal communication process that you go through to get the product to the customer. And I did some calculations, and basically, if you do a week iteration, it takes you half an hour to install it. You install it in 3 computers, and you spend half an hour on that. That is close to 20 days of a person's time going away. You multiply that with 400 installations, internal communication, it becomes basically, you get to a point where the wheels stop turning, and all that you're doing is the developers are doing support, installations, and things like that. So we came up with this, and to be honest with you, it started with a spreadsheet that became an Access database, and went to SQL Server, and now it's sort of a web-based product. But what we have is a couple of tables, and a lot of the concepts that I have came from CMM. We have an audit trail of everything that gets done. So all these tables, whenever somebody updates it, you know who updated it, to keep a history of what was updated in that table. Because it's amazing how a defect can become a feature, and it goes through this whole life cycle.
So, and that has value, right? And that's good. And you put it in because you want it, because it's value for you.
Okay,
right?
sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, it was important for me because when you do commercial software, you really need to have some audit controls in place. You cannot just have a developer and somebody ships to 400 customers, the stuff breaks. We sell to banks and credit unions. There's fiduciary requirements for them. You know, if their data gets compromised, you get the FBI on you. So the model that we have is, we have an iteration. Sorry, I'll try and find there. we have a feature set that hangs off the iteration, we have defect and development stories, and then those defects and development stories are tied to CVS. So when I check my stuff into CVS, that same change record goes into the database. We also have a phased approach, a waterfall approach if you want to. Basically, we have 3 products available at any point in time that I can compile, install, and things like that. So there's a piece that's in development. Once I'm done with development, it gets turned over to quality control. My developers are done with that. They now start developing on the next piece that I'm going to ship to the customer. So I don't have, of course I have a lot of production because I have a history of things that went to production. But I don't have two iterations currently under commercialization, which is a nice term for quality control. They've got to get that to the customer before I give them the next bucket of features that they can go to the customer. You need this because internally, if you look at your internal organization, commercialization for us is, and I have a list of, I have another card there somewhere, I'll just wing it, but you have the user. Every user has got a different level of tolerance for change. I was on the phone this week with a customer. He says, I want one yearly update. And I said, when will we going to give you new features? He said, are you going to give me an upgrade? He said, when's the last time you had an upgrade? March last year. They're not going to work in an agile environment. You have your salespeople. They just want to know about the new stuff. A weekly iteration is too much for them. Finance, you have accounting, who's got what product. We have 23 different, and this is what we have here, is we have 23 different sub-pieces that we build code for. In other words, this guy has got this piece in, you now need to start thinking about who's on what version of the code. Okay. And you can see that it becomes totally, I won't call it a nightmare, but you want to do agile, you've got to be quick with it. So 1 minute, okay. So I have history of all times. So I can at any point build any iteration with all the files associated with it. I have a change control list that goes to the customer that describes every feature that goes to every product, and that can be distributed internally or externally. I can't move things from development into commercialization or QA until all those tasks are done with development. And the same, I can't move into production if every little story in that thing is marked as we looked at it, we created documentation, stories, user training, etc., that needs to make it into a commercial product. So that's it.
Question?
Sure.
So this is an application or utility that you grew yourself?
Yes.
What does it look like on a developer? Do they have something that's on the screen that pops up? Or?
Well, a developer, if he looks at a file that's, in Eclipse and CVS, he can look at the history of the file. Every file is labeled and say, this is the file changes, this is what iteration these file changes became active, what is the story that was associated with it, as well as when he goes and he finishes a story, he's got to actually go, he has an area where all the files that he's checked in that's not currently associated with the story, so he has a small list and he's got to click, 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 click and associate the story, and that's when the labeling happens from the database side.
Okay, so he's seeing this in the CVS history of the file, or is it separate?
He sees the file that he has changed that's not currently associated with the story, and he just needs to associate it. He's got to choose the right story and associate it, and then it gets labeled through the whole process to say this whole iteration.
So but you're seeing that in the web, I'm sorry.
And a web interface, yeah.
Web page, okay.
Yeah. So.
Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Well, technical project manager for every element, talk about it.
All right. It was actually kind of hard to narrow this presentation down. Usually I have about a half hour to an hour, so putting it to 5 minutes was kind of hard. So we'll see how it goes. So, not quite, don't know how much or how familiar you guys are with Scrum, but basically it's an agile method for software development. And it's primarily used when requirements are changing drastically or if they're highly emergent throughout the project. So it helps with those sorts of projects. And also, let's see, so there's 3 main roles a person can have in Scrum, and there's 2 tools that are utilized in Scrum. The tools are the product backlog and the sprint backlog. And the roles are Scrum team member, Scrum team master, and also the product owner. So I'll use this to explain basically what the Scrum process is. So you have a product backlog, which is basically, Scrum doesn't utilize Microsoft Project Management. Ken Schwaber, which was the guy that I went to be certified in Scrum, explained a great project management tool he had. It was called Excel. So it works pretty nice. And basically, the backlog is just an Excel list of all the user stories that would complete the project as you know it at that time. So the user stories are either business-centric or technical in nature, and the product owner prioritizes everything on the backlog. So you begin the process by creating the entire backlog, and then you have a sprint planning meeting. And sprints are usually between 2 and 4 weeks. Scrum purists would say that every sprint would need to be exactly a month. But if you look in the industry, most people use between 2 and 3, sometimes a month, but it depends on your industry. So something that's very creative, ever-changing, like the gaming industry, for example, they primarily use 2-week sprints because of all the graphical designs that would need to change and things like that. So depending on your business and the type of software that you're creating, you would use either a 2 to 4 week sprint. During the sprint meeting, the product owner would prioritize everything, and then they would explain the highest priority items that are on the backlog. They would explain it enough so that the developers could then go back through and ask questions about the items to try to figure out what tasks they would have to do in order to complete it, and they would give a high-level estimate. The developers would then go off and determine of the highest priority tasks what they thought that they could actually complete in the iteration, and then they would ask questions of the product owner to describe things a little bit more if they needed that. So you would create the sprint backlog from there. Everything else that did not make the sprint backlog would remain on the product backlog at that time. And then you would go into your iterations. One of the nice things about this Scrum process is that the team gathers once a day. I prefer usually in the morning to do that. And you talk about 3 things. You talk about what you achieved yesterday, what you're going to achieve today, and if you have any blocks. So as a Scrum Master, your primary responsibility is to remove all the roadblocks from all the developers so they can continue developing. It helps to have developers focus on what they're working on instead of these side tangent things, and keeps the project focused and helps everything move along. So you meet daily, and then at the end of your sprint, you have a sprint review meeting. And during that review meeting, you would go through and kind of display everything that you've worked on to the product owner at that time. One of the things I forgot to mention is that at the end of the sprint, you want a potential incremental delivery that you can, if the project, everybody's gonna have projects that have been cut short halfway through. So it's actually nice that if you've gone through 3 sprints of 5, that at that 3rd sprint you can actually deliver something valuable, and it would be the highest priority things to the customer at that time. And then you would, after the sprint review, you would start the next sprint. Again, the whole backlist of items would be, the backlog would be reprioritized. Things may have been added or deleted based on what you've completed so far, and you would just complete the process. At the end, you have a release sprint where you plan all the things that you have to do to actually release the software. And you have a happy customer, a happy group of people, and one of the biggest things that is nice about Scrum is scope change. And you don't really have to worry too much about that because the backlog takes care of that. You get the highest priority thing done at the beginning, and makes for a happy project manager, I think. So.
Does Scrum have anything to say about testing or how you develop or design or?
Well, Scrum is kind of a wrapper to any type of programming methodology that you have. So like Scrum is a perfect wrapper to XP. It's a perfect wrapper to most of those things. So Scrum doesn't dictate how you test, it just says, you should probably do that. So depending on, what methodology you're using.
How do you prevent meetings from getting out of hand? You're having one every day with all your team.
Well, on the current process, or the project that I'm running right now, I'm the Scrum Master. So my duty is to keep it short. You're supposed to answer those 3 questions and those 3 questions only. And if it goes past that, then people can talk after the meeting, talk in the hallway, things like that. That's why you kind of limit it to the 3. One of the big things that a lot of the developers like to do is talk about the problems. Because, you finally have a forum where people will listen to you and care about what you're talking about. So you kind of have to follow that a lot. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Whose responsibility is the product backlog? Of the team members that you mentioned, or is it somebody else?
The product backlog is owned by the product owner, and there's just one product owner. Usually it's somebody in marketing or a key user. At Priority Health, where I work, the product owner is actually the business project manager. So they add things to it. I'm not sure if it's actually pure Scrum, but I'll add things to it too and let the product owner know. I add a lot more of the technical items that we have to do to it. They add a lot of the user.
So there's a cooperative effort on that?
Yeah. But I'm not in charge of any of the priority.
That's totally up to the product owner.
It is. Now, they have to be compliant with, if one of my technical-centric requirements is dependent on one of theirs, mine has to get done first. But they would understand the dependencies and then prioritize based on that.
And those are expressed in that backlog?
Yep. Oh, I can actually. An example of that.
Really scrunched on time.
Okay. So, yeah, I have some more examples. In the product backlog, we actually have that somewhere.
You guys take turns, or you have a dedicated Scrum Master?
At Priority Health, just the technical project managers and the Scrum Masters.
Is the training worth it? You went through training?
Yep.
Certification?
Yeah, I thought it was really good. It was a really good forum to talk to people in other industries and figure out how they're doing it. So I liked it. It was good. Plus, it was winter in San Diego, so.
So how would you compare it to what you were doing before you were doing Scrum? Big improvement, kind of a wash?
Personally, I like it a lot because it takes a lot of the pressure off of me to deliver a product when the scope is constantly changing. That's been the biggest thing. The business has actually been kind of resistant to it. They don't like it. They like it, but they don't. They don't like the rigidness of it. And vice versa, they don't like the flexibility either. So, but I don't think they'll keep having
I'm going to cut this off. I think this would be a great topic for next year to hear more about your experience in detail. You guys agree?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Next, Scott Miller. David Wilson.
Some of you guys might remember me from last month's talk about MVP, that Carl, that honorarium check, must have got lost in the mail. Tonight I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the little helper tools that we use to sort of facilitate MVP development. And I'm going to